On the morning of October 14th, 1867, the auction at Parnell's General Store in Dawson Creek, Nebraska, drew every farmer and rancher within 20 miles. The wind carried the smell of frost across the plains, and the cottonwoods along the creek had already turned gold. Men stood with their hands stuffed in their coat pockets, shuffling their boots in the dust. Women watched from wagons, their breath rising in pale wisps against a sky the color of cold iron. The auctioneer, a round man named Stokes, cleared his throat and read from the county ledger with the gravity of a circuit judge. Most of the lots had already been claimed. The good bottomland, the parcels near the creek, the sections with standing timber. What remained was a patchwork of scrub prairie and rocky ground that nobody wanted, the dregs of the territorial land office's holdings. Stokes had saved the worst for last, the way a man sweeps crumbs off a table after a feast. "Lot 47, he called out, adjusting his spectacles. 11 acres, Section 9, including the former Bickford grain silo. Collapsed in the storm of '64. Structural damage extensive. County assessment, $3. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The Bickford silo was a local joke, the kind of story men told in taverns when the conversation turned to foolishness and bad luck. Old Amos Bickford had built the thing in 1859, a massive stone cylinder meant to hold grain for 3 seasons. He'd sunk his savings into limestone blocks, quarried from the bluff itself, hired a crew of 8 men, and dug 30 feet into the hillside to anchor the foundation. The silo had been a monument to ambition, 40 feet tall, 15 feet across, with walls 3 feet thick at the base. Then, the cyclone of '64 came screaming across the plains, peeled the roof off, cracked the upper walls into rubble, and sent Amos packing for Iowa with nothing but a wagon and a debt he'd carry to his grave. The silo had stood half-ruined ever since, its broken stone walls jutting from the hillside like a shattered tooth. $3 for a hole in the ground, someone shouted, and the crowd laughed again. Thomas Adler stood at the edge of the gathering, apart from the others. He was 31 years old, lean and angular, with dark eyes that seemed to take in more than they gave away. His hands were large and scarred from 6 years of survey work, and he had a way of standing perfectly still that made people uncomfortable. He wore a patched coat that had belonged to his father, brown wool, threadbare at the elbows, and his boots were worn nearly through at the soles. In his breast pocket, he carried a letter from his brother Edwin in Ohio, the letter that had brought him here. The letter was brief. Edwin had written to inform Thomas that their father had died on August 3rd, following a long illness, and that the family farm outside Columbus had been sold to cover debts. Thomas's share of the proceeds amounted to $9.40. Edwin had enclosed the money in banknotes. There was no invitation to come to Ohio. There was no expression of grief or brotherly warmth. There was no mention of the years Thomas had spent as the family's least regarded son, the quiet one, the reader, the one who preferred books on geology and natural philosophy to plowing, the one their mother had called our dreamer, with a smile that carried an edge of disappointment sharp enough to draw blood. Thomas had understood the letter's silence perfectly. Edwin had always been the favored son, older, stronger, married to a woman named Prudence who believed that family property should be consolidated, not divided. The $9.40 was not a share. It was a dismissal. Thomas had spent 6 years working as a surveyor's assistant in Kansas, learning to read land the way other men read newspapers. He understood limestone and shale, knew how water carved through rock over centuries, and could estimate the depth of a water table by studying the vegetation on a hillside. He had come to Dawson Creek because he'd heard the land was cheap, and because cheap land was the only kind a man with $9 could afford. $3, Thomas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the crowd with the clarity of a stone dropped into still water. Stokes peered at him over his spectacles. $3 for Lot 47? The Bickford silo lot? That's right. The laughter was louder this time. A rancher named Griff Holloway, who owned 600 acres of good grassland to the south and had a reputation for opinions delivered at volume, shook his head and grinned. Son, you just bought yourself a pile of rocks and a headache. Holloway's wife tugged his sleeve and whispered something. Holloway laughed, a booming sound that scattered sparrows from the general store's eaves. My wife wants to know if you plan to live in the hole. Thomas looked at Holloway for a long moment. The crowd waited, expecting anger or shame or some stumbling defense. Thomas offered none of these things. He simply folded the receipt Stokes handed him and put it in his pocket beside his brother's letter. He picked up his pack, which contained a bedroll, a hand axe, 2 books, a compass, and a tin of matches, and walked north toward the bluff without a word. Behind him, the laughter continued. It followed him like a dog that didn't know when to stop. The Bickford silo was worse than Thomas had expected, and he had not expected much. The circular stone walls, which had once risen 40 feet above ground, were shattered down to about 12 feet on the windward side, and perhaps 18 on the lee. Fallen stones lay scattered across the hillside like the aftermath of a siege. The wooden roof was gone entirely, and the interior was open to the sky. Scrub cedar and sumac had colonized the rubble, their roots wedging into cracks in the masonry. But it was the underground portion that drew Thomas's attention. Bickford had excavated a cylindrical shaft roughly 15 feet in diameter and 30 feet deep into the limestone bluff. The original purpose had been purely structural, to anchor the silo's foundation in bedrock and provide a deep storage cellar for grain. The walls of the shaft were natural rock, pale gray limestone, smooth where Bickford's men had chiseled it flat, rough where the stone had fractured along natural seams and been left alone. At the bottom, the floor was dry and surprisingly level. A natural shelf of harder stone, a dolomite layer Thomas recognized, had resisted erosion more than the limestone above and below, creating a ledge about 8 feet above the floor that formed something like a natural mezzanine. Thomas climbed down using a rope he anchored to a fallen wall stone, lowering himself hand over hand into the shaft. The temperature hit him immediately, like stepping into a different season. It was October, and the air above was 43 degrees and dropping fast toward the first hard frost. Down here, the air was warm. Not hot, but warm, distinctly warm, the way a root cellar feels in January, except more so. The warmth was not stale or stagnant. It moved. Thomas could feel a faint current against his face, a breath of air rising from somewhere below. He pressed his palm flat against the limestone wall. The stone was warm to the touch, as though it had been sitting in weak sunlight, though no sunlight had reached this depth in 3 years or possibly ever. Thomas stood there for a long time, his hand on the stone, his mind working. He had read about geothermal warmth in a book called Principles of Geological Science by James Dwight Dana, which he'd borrowed from the surveyor's personal library in Topeka, and never returned. He knew that the Earth's temperature increased with depth, roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 60 feet of descent, though the gradient varied considerably with local geology. But 30 feet of depth alone shouldn't produce warmth this noticeable. The temperature in the shaft felt like it was in the upper 50s at least, perhaps touching 60, 15 or 20 degrees warmer than it should be at this depth in October. There had to be something else, something beneath. He spent the rest of that first day exploring every inch of the shaft. He ran his fingers along the walls, feeling for cracks and seams. He pressed his ear to the stone and listened. He studied the way dust moved in the air, the way his breath dissipated. He was thorough and methodical, a man trained by 6 years of survey work to trust measurement over assumption. He found it just before dusk, a narrow fissure in the limestone, barely wide enough to fit his arm, running along the base of the eastern wall where the stone met the floor. The crack was perhaps 3 inches across at its widest point and ran vertically downward at a slight angle, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of sight. Warm air rose from the fissure in a steady, gentle current, carrying a faint mineral smell, sulfur and iron and something else, something ancient and clean, like rain on hot stone. Thomas lit a match and held it near the fissure. The flame bent sharply sideways, drawn toward the crack, then reversed and streamed upward as the warm air from below caught it. There was airflow, significant, sustained airflow, from somewhere much deeper in the earth. This was not residual heat or passive conduction. This was convection. Something far below was heating air and sending it upward through this crack in the rock, and the crack was acting as a natural chimney, venting warmth into the shaft. That night, Thomas slept at the bottom of the shaft, wrapped in his bedroll on the bare stone floor. He guessed the temperature at 60 degrees, perhaps 62. Above him, the stars turned in a perfect circle framed by the broken walls of the silo, and the Milky Way stretched across the opening like a river of light. The wind howled across the prairie, driving the temperature on the surface down toward freezing, rattling the scrub cedars in the rubble above. Down here, the air was still and warm and quiet, and the stone floor held him the way a cupped hand holds water. He slept better than he had in months, possibly in years. Over the following weeks, Thomas began the work that would consume the next 3 years of his life and define the remaining 47. He had $6.40 remaining after the land purchase, a fact he recorded on the first page of a small leather notebook he'd bought in Topeka for 15 cents. The notebook, which had been intended for survey measurements, would eventually fill with observations, temperature readings, sketches, construction notes, and calculations. 247 pages of meticulous handwriting that his granddaughter Clara would donate to the Nebraska State Historical Society in 1952, where it remains in the archive to this day. His first task was structural. The collapsed silo walls above ground were a hazard. Loose stones could shift and fall into the shaft, but the stone itself was enormously valuable. Quarried limestone blocks, already cut and shaped, were worth far more than Thomas had paid for the entire lot. He spent 2 weeks sorting rubble, working sunrise to sunset, separating intact blocks from shattered ones. The good blocks, and there were hundreds, he stacked methodically along the hillside, organizing them by size and shape the way a carpenter organizes lumber. The broken stone he used to build a rough staircase descending into the shaft, laying flat pieces as treads and filling the gaps with smaller fragments, replacing the rope with something permanent. He cut cedar poles from a stand of trees a mile to the east, dragging them back to the site one at a time, and used them as supports, bracing them between the stone walls at intervals to hold the staircase in place. The physical labor was brutal. Thomas was lean but not large, and the stones were heavy. He developed blisters that broke and bled and broke again, and his shoulders ached so badly by evening that raising his arms above his head made him gasp. But the work had a rhythm to it, a logic, and Thomas found that the rhythm sustained him the way food and sleep could not. Each stone placed was a fact established, a measurement confirmed. The staircase grew, step by step, and each step was proof that something was being built. By early November, he had a functional shelter. The underground shaft was his living quarters. He'd built a sleeping platform on the natural dolomite ledge, 8 feet above the floor, where the warmth was most concentrated. Warm air rises, and the ledge caught it. He'd hauled cedar boughs down for a mattress and covered them with his bedroll. Below, at ground level, he'd arranged a workspace, a flat stone for a table, shelves carved into niches in the limestone, using his hand axe, and a chisel he'd bought in town for 35 cents, and a small fire pit positioned near the base of the thermal fissure. The fire pit placement was deliberate and clever. The fissure acted as a natural chimney, drawing smoke downward into the crack and away through whatever network of passages existed below. The draft was strong enough that even a smoky fire of green wood produced no buildup of fumes in the shaft. Thomas could cook, heat water, and warm the space without any of the smoke problems that plagued surface dwellings with poorly designed chimneys. And the fire pit was barely necessary. Thomas recorded the temperature in his notebook daily, sometimes twice daily, with the obsessive precision of a man who has found something that fascinates him. At the bottom of the shaft, the ambient temperature held steady between 58 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the weather above. When he built even a small fire, a few sticks of cedar burned for 20 minutes. The stone walls absorbed the heat and radiated it back slowly over the following hours, raising the temperature to the mid-70s and holding it there long after the flames died. The limestone, he realized, was acting as a massive thermal battery, storing energy in its crystalline structure and releasing it gradually, the way a brick oven stays warm long after the baker has gone home. The warm air rising from the deep fissure was the engine of the entire system. Thomas theorized, correctly, as geologists at the University of Nebraska would confirm in 1923, that the fissure connected to a minor fault line that intersected geothermally active strata several hundred feet below the surface. Warm groundwater moving along the fault heated the surrounding rock, and the heated air rose through the fissure by natural convection, entering the shaft at a temperature of approximately 68 degrees year-round. This constant influx of warm air heated the surrounding limestone walls, which stored and redistributed the warmth, creating a microclimate in the shaft that was 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the surface in winter and 10 to 15 degrees cooler in summer. Thomas didn't have the vocabulary to describe this in modern terms. He called it the breathing, because the fissure seemed to exhale warm air the way a sleeping animal breathes, steadily, reliably, without conscious effort. People in Dawson Creek heard about the man living in the old Bickford hole. The story traveled the way stories do in small communities, through the general store, the church porch, the blacksmith shop, accumulating embellishments at each stop like a snowball rolling downhill. By November, the story had Thomas living naked in a pit, eating raw raccoon and talking to the rocks. The truth was considerably less dramatic, but drama was never the point. Griff Holloway told anyone who'd listen that the silo man would freeze to death by January. Mrs. Pritchard, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the moral compass of Dawson Creek, said it was a sin and a shame for a grown man to live like a badger. A German farmer named Holst said he'd seen Thomas emerging from the ground at dawn and had mistaken him for a ghost. The general consensus was that Thomas Adler was either touched in the head or too poor to know better, and that neither condition warranted much sympathy. Thomas visited town once every 2 weeks to buy salt, flour, coffee, and occasionally a newspaper with the dwindling remains of his inheritance. He said little on these visits. He listened. He noticed that the same people who mocked his underground home spent half the winter huddled around cast-iron stoves, burning through cords of wood at $1.50 per cord, stuffing rags into window cracks to keep out drafts, and complaining endlessly about the cold. His underground shelter required almost no fuel at all. The irony was not lost on him, but he kept it to himself. Arguing with people who had already made up their minds was, Thomas believed, the least productive use of time ever invented. The first winter was the proving ground. January of 1868 brought the worst cold snap the territory had seen in a decade. A polar air mass descended from Canada and sat over the plains like a stone on a grave. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero. The creek froze solid, then froze deeper. Icicles hung from the eaves of buildings in town like the bars of a cage. 2 of Holloway's calves died in the open, their bodies found standing upright in the snow, frozen in the posture of living things. The Pritchard boarding house burned through its entire winter wood supply by the first week of February, and Mrs. Pritchard was reduced to buying green timber from a profiteering woodcutter at $3 a cord. Men rode to town with frost on their beards, their fingers white inside their gloves, cursing the wind and the winter, and Nebraska in general. Thomas recorded a low of 56 degrees inside his shaft on the coldest night of the year. He slept in his shirt sleeves. He slept well. He spent the cold months improving his shelter with the unhurried diligence of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing to prove except to himself. He mortared the staircase with a clay and lime mixture he made from materials found on his own land, red clay from a bank near the creek, and lime produced by burning limestone fragments in his fire pit. He sealed the gaps between the staircase stones until the structure was solid and smooth. He built a door at the top of the staircase from salvaged silo timber, heavy planks of oak that Bickford had used for the original roof framing, and hung it on iron hinges he traded a day's labor for at the blacksmith's shop. The door created an airlock that trapped warm air inside the shaft, reducing heat loss and eliminating drafts. He widened the natural dolomite ledge with careful chiseling, working slowly to avoid cracking the stone, creating a second sleeping platform 6 feet from the first. He carved a channel in the floor to direct water seepage, a slow but persistent trickle through the limestone, toward a collection basin he hollowed from the rock, giving himself a small but reliable water supply, fed by condensation and natural filtration. By spring, Thomas had something more than a shelter. He had a home. It was not a home that anyone in Dawson Creek would have recognized as such. It was underground, lit by lantern, reached by a stone staircase through a heavy oak door, but it was warm, dry, secure, and entirely his. He had built it with his own hands from materials that cost him almost nothing. He had done it alone, and it worked. The second year brought discovery, the kind that changes the shape of a life. In March of 1868, while widening a storage niche in the eastern wall of the shaft, he wanted space for the growing collection of preserves he'd put up from wild plums and service berries. Thomas broke through a thin layer of limestone and felt his chisel plunge into empty air. He pulled the chisel back and peered into the gap. Darkness and a breath of warm air against his face. The cavity behind the wall was a natural void in the limestone, a dissolution chamber created over millions of years as slightly acidic groundwater had dissolved the rock along a horizontal seam of softer material. Thomas spent a full day carefully enlarging the opening, working with excruciating patience, chipping away stone an inch at a time to avoid collapsing the passage. When the opening was wide enough to crawl through, he lit his lantern and entered on his hands and knees. The chamber was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with an irregular ceiling that ranged from 5 feet at the edges to about 6.5 at the center. Low enough to require ducking, but high enough to stand in, barely, at the middle. The floor was level and dry, covered in a thin layer of calcium carbonate dust that had precipitated from evaporating water over centuries. The air was warm and still, with a faint mineral tang that reminded Thomas of the smell near hot springs he'd encountered during his survey work in Kansas. But it was the walls that seized his attention and would not let go. The chamber walls were covered in mineral deposits, calcite formations in shades of white, cream, and pale amber, some smooth as glass, others textured like frozen cascades of water. Flowstone draped portions of the ceiling in curtain-like formations, translucent at the edges, glowing amber and gold in the lantern light. Veins of darker material, manganese dioxide, Thomas guessed, though he wouldn't be sure until a geologist confirmed it years later, ran through the calcite like frozen rivers, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic, as though some ancient intelligence had decorated the space. And on the far wall, where a section of the limestone had fractured along a bedding plane and exposed a clean cross-section of ancient rock, there were fossils. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps. Shells mostly, brachiopods with their distinctive butterfly wing shapes, crinoid stems like stacks of tiny coins, fragments of bryozoan colonies that resembled petrified lace. The fossils were embedded in the rock face in dense concentrations, a record of life written in stone, covering a surface area the size of a barn door. But among the shells, larger and more striking than anything else, was the clear impression of a fish, a complete skeleton, perhaps 18 inches long, pressed into the stone with extraordinary clarity and detail. Thomas could see individual vertebrae, the fan of the tail, the delicate arcs of the ribs, and the hollow where the eye had been. The fish lay in the stone as naturally as if it had simply decided to rest there 300 million years ago and never gotten up. Thomas sat on the floor of the chamber and stared at the fossil by lantern light for over an hour. He did not move. He barely breathed. The lantern flame flickered against the calcite walls, and the fossils seemed to shift in the moving light, as though the ancient creatures were still swimming in their ancient sea. He had read about such things in Dana's book. He knew, in an intellectual way, that the limestone plains of Nebraska had once been the floor of a vast, shallow ocean that covered the interior of the continent during the Paleozoic era. He knew that the shells and bones of marine creatures had drifted to the bottom of that ocean and been buried in sediment that eventually became stone. But knowing it and seeing it were different experiences entirely, as different as reading about fire and putting your hand in the flame. The fish had been alive. It had swum through warm water in a world that bore no resemblance to the cold Nebraska prairie above. It had eaten, fled from predators, perhaps spawned, and then it had died and sunk to the bottom and been pressed into mud that became stone, and the stone had been lifted by geological forces over inconceivable stretches of time. And now Thomas Adler, a 31-year-old man with $9 to his name and a home underground, was the first human being ever to look at it. The distance between that creature's moment and this one was so vast that it made Thomas's own troubles, the inheritance, the mockery, the cold, the loneliness, seem like dust on the surface of deep water. Not unimportant exactly, but very, very small. He began to excavate carefully the next morning, using a small chisel and a brush he fashioned from horsehair, tied to a cedar stick. Over the following weeks, he uncovered more fossils. A section of crinoid colony preserved in 3 dimensions, several exceptionally well-preserved brachiopod specimens with both valves intact, fragments of an ancient coral reef, and what appeared to be a trilobite, rolled into a defensive posture as though it had died afraid. He recorded everything in his notebook: locations, dimensions, sketches rendered with the precise hand of a former surveyor's assistant, with the meticulous care of a man who understood that he was looking at something more important than himself. The question was what to do about it. Thomas had no formal scientific credentials. He was a surveyor's assistant who read books and lived in a hole, but he knew enough about the state of American natural history to understand that well-preserved Paleozoic marine fossils were of serious interest to the scientific institutions back east, which were engaged in a fierce and occasionally undignified competition to build their collections. In April of 1868, he wrote a letter to Professor Othniel Charles Marsh at Yale College's Peabody Museum of Natural History, describing his find in precise, restrained language. He included 3 of his better sketches: the fish, the crinoid colony, and a particularly fine brachiopod, drawn on pages torn from his notebook. The letter took 6 weeks to reach New Haven by mail. The reply, which arrived in Dawson Creek in early July, was written on Yale letterhead in a confident hand and took Thomas's breath away. Marsh was interested, more than interested. He was eager. He wrote that the sketches suggested specimens of considerable scientific value and proposed to send a representative to inspect the site at the earliest opportunity. He enclosed a draft for $5 to cover any expenses Thomas might incur in preserving the specimens. Thomas put the $5 in his notebook and spent nothing. The specimens needed no preservation. The cave had been preserving them for 300 million years. The representative arrived in September of 1868, a young geologist named Arthur Brennan, 26 years old, freshly minted from Yale, with a degree in natural history and an enthusiasm for fieldwork that had not yet been tempered by the reality of fieldwork in Nebraska. Brennan was pale, slight, and dressed in clothes better suited to a lecture hall. He was completely unprepared for Thomas Adler. "You live in a hole," Brennan said, standing at the top of the staircase and peering down into the lamplit shaft with an expression that combined scientific curiosity with personal alarm. "I live underground," Thomas corrected mildly. "There's a difference." "It's the same thing, isn't it? A badger lives in a hole. I have a staircase, a door, a fire pit with a natural flue, a water supply, and 2 sleeping platforms. I also have bookshelves. A badger does not have bookshelves." Brennan descended the staircase with the caution of a man entering a pharaoh's tomb, one hand on the cedar handrail, the other gripping his notebook. By the time he reached the bottom, his skepticism had undergone a transformation. The temperature alone astonished him. He had left a surface temperature of 48 degrees and descended into air that felt like a mild spring day. He pressed his palm against the limestone wall, just as Thomas had done a year earlier, and felt the warmth radiating from the stone. "How is this possible?" Brennan asked, and his voice had lost its condescension entirely. Thomas showed him the fissure. He explained his theory about the fault line and the thermal strata, pointing out the direction of airflow, the way dust particles moved in the warm current, the subtle but measurable temperature gradient between the floor and the ledge. Brennan listened with the focused intensity of a man who has stumbled upon something he will write papers about for the next decade. Then Thomas showed him the fossils. Brennan spent 3 days in the chamber. He crawled on his hands and knees across the floor, holding his lantern inches from the rock face, filling a notebook with sketches and notes and exclamation points. He confirmed what Thomas had suspected. The specimens were significant. The fish fossil, in particular, was an exceptionally well-preserved example of a Paleozoic actinopterygian that appeared to represent a species not previously described in the scientific literature. The calcite formations on the walls were remarkable in their own right, evidence of a complex geological history that combined marine deposition, dissolution, and recrystallization over hundreds of millions of years. The thermal fissure was, geologically speaking, a minor miracle, a natural vent connected to a deep heat source that created conditions unlike anything Brennan had encountered or read about. "Mr. Adler," Brennan said on his last evening, sitting at Thomas's stone table and eating beans and salt pork from a tin plate by lantern light, "you are sitting on something that any natural history museum in the country would pay handsomely to study. Professor Marsh will want to send a full expedition. This could be one of the most important fossil localities in the Western Territories." "I'm not interested in selling the fossils," Thomas said. "They belong where they are. They've been there longer than anyone has been anywhere." Brennan blinked. "Then what do you want?" Thomas considered the question. He looked at the warm stone walls around him, the staircase he'd built stone by stone, the shelves holding his 2 books and his notebook, and the lantern that cast a steady golden light against 300 million years of history. "I want to understand them," he said, "and I want to keep living here." Brennan stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as though something had come into focus. "I think," he said, "that can be arranged." The arrangement, when it came, was more generous than Thomas had expected, and more structured than he would have chosen. Professor Marsh offered a stipend of $40 per year, modest by Eastern standards, but a meaningful sum on the Nebraska prairie, in exchange for ongoing access to the site for scientific study. Thomas would serve as the site's custodian, guardian, and guide. He would not be required to leave. The fossils would remain in situ. Yale's Peabody Museum would send researchers periodically, and Thomas would assist them with excavation, cataloging, and site maintenance. In return, Thomas would be credited in any publications resulting from work done at the site. It was, by any measure, a vindication. The man who had been mocked for buying a $3 hole in the ground now had an income, a purpose, and a connection to one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the country. But Thomas did not think of it as vindication. He thought of it as work. The kind of work he had always wanted, the kind that involved looking at things carefully and trying to understand what they meant. The autumn of 1869 brought the first full research team. Brennan again, accompanied by a senior geologist named Dr. Edwin Hale and a preparator named Sullivan, whose job was to make plaster casts of the best specimens for Yale's collection. They stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in canvas tents above ground, while Thomas remained in his warm shaft below. The nights turned cold in late October, and the scientists huddled around their campfire in heavy coats, while Thomas, 30 feet beneath them, read Dana by lantern light in his shirt sleeves. The contrast amused everyone except Thomas, who simply thought the scientists were being stubborn. It was during this visit that Thomas met Clara. Clara Engel arrived in Dawson Creek in October of 1869, traveling with her father, Henrik Engel, a Danish-born carpenter who had been hired to build new shelving and cabinetry for Parnell's general store. Henrik was 60 years old and ailing, his lungs scarred and weakened by decades of breathing sawdust in poorly ventilated workshops. He coughed constantly, a deep, wet sound that made people step away from him in the street. Clara was 27, tall and direct, with strong hands, a level gaze, and an education acquired through sheer stubbornness and systematic use of lending libraries in 3 states. She had taught herself to read English, German, and French. She kept a daily journal. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable, not because they were rude, but because they required genuine thought to answer. Clara met Thomas when she walked to the bluff to see the caveman everyone in town was whispering about. She expected to find a hermit or a lunatic, some wild-eyed recluse living in squalor. She found a clean-shaven man sitting on a stone step in the autumn sunshine, reading a copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology with the focused concentration of a scholar, while a group of Yale scientists argued about brachiopod taxonomy 20 feet underground. "You're the one who lives down there?" she asked. Thomas looked up. "I am." "Is it really warm? Come and see." She descended the staircase without hesitation. Most people who visited the shaft for the first time were visibly nervous. The depth, the closeness of the stone walls, the feeling of the earth pressing in from all sides, the awareness of all that weight above. Clara simply looked around with open curiosity, touched the warm wall with her palm, examined the fossil chamber with evident interest, and asked Thomas how the thermal fissure worked. He explained. She asked follow-up questions about the temperature gradient, about the mineral content of the air, about the geological age of the limestone, that revealed she had read something about geology herself, though she couldn't remember the author's name. "Donna," Thomas said. "James Dwight Donna. That's the one. My father had a copy years ago when we lived in Pennsylvania." She paused, and her expression shifted. "He's sick. His lungs. The doctor in town says there's not much to be done." Thomas nodded slowly. "The air down here is clean. No dust, no pollen, no smoke. Constant humidity, around 60%. Constant temperature. I've noticed my own breathing has improved since I moved underground. I used to have trouble in the winters." Clara looked at him, really looked, the way Thomas himself looked at things. And something passed between them that neither of them could have named. It was not romance, not yet. It was recognition. The sense of encountering a mind that worked the way your own did, that valued the same things, that looked before it decided. Henrik Engel moved into the shaft 2 weeks later, sleeping on the second platform Thomas had built on the Dolomite ledge. The warm, humid, dust-free air acted on his damaged lungs like a balm. Within days, his coughing diminished. Within a month, he could breathe deeply without pain for the first time in years. The underground chamber functioned as a natural sanitarium. Constant temperature, clean air, stable humidity. Conditions that physicians would prescribe for respiratory patients decades later, but that Thomas had stumbled upon simply by paying attention to how the earth worked. Clara visited her father daily, then stayed longer, then began helping Thomas with his work. She proved to be extraordinarily skilled with tools. Her father had taught her carpentry from childhood, and she possessed an eye for design and livability that Thomas, for all his practical intelligence, completely lacked. Where Thomas thought in terms of function, will it hold weight? Will it keep out water? Will it last? Clara thought in terms of life. She suggested widening the main staircase from 2 feet to 3, making it comfortable rather than merely passable. She designed a ventilation system using 2 narrow shafts drilled at opposing angles through the limestone, creating a cross-draft that freshened the air without losing heat. She proposed whitewashing the interior walls with a lime mixture that would brighten the chambers and make them feel less like a cave and more like a dwelling. They married in March of 1870 in a small ceremony at the Dawson Creek Church. Henrik gave Clara away, and his breathing was steady throughout the service. Griff Holloway attended. He had been invited out of politeness and had accepted out of curiosity, and to his credit, he shook Thomas's hand afterward and said nothing whatsoever about holes in the ground. The years that followed were years of building, of transformation, so gradual and so steady that it could only be measured in retrospect, the way one measures the growth of a tree. By 1872, the original shaft had been expanded into a complex of interconnected chambers, all carved from the living limestone by Thomas and Clara, working side by side. The main living area occupied the original shaft, now fitted with a proper wooden floor laid over the stone, a cast-iron stove connected to the natural fissure flue, and walls that Clara had smoothed and whitewashed until they glowed with a soft, warm light that made lanterns seem brighter than they were. The fossil chamber had been christened the study and left largely unaltered, its walls exposed to display the ancient shells and the celebrated fish fossil that was already appearing in scientific publications. A new chamber excavated to the west served as a bedroom, its entrance hung with a curtain Clara sewed from heavy wool. A fourth room, smaller and lined with cedar shelves Thomas had milled from timber he cut himself, functioned as a root cellar and pantry that maintained a constant temperature of 55 degrees, perfect for preserving food through every season. Above ground, Thomas built a ranch house using the salvaged silo blocks. The construction took 2 full years, 1870 to 1872, and Thomas laid every stone himself, with Clara's help on the design. The house was modest, 3 rooms and a covered porch, but it was solid, handsome, and cleverly integrated with the underground complex below. Thomas designed a system of floor vents connecting the house to the shaft beneath it, so that warm air from the geothermal fissure could rise through the openings into the rooms above. In winter, the house stayed comfortable with minimal additional heating. A small fire in the cast-iron stove on the coldest days was sufficient. In summer, when the prairie baked under 100-degree sun, cool air from the deeper chambers rose through the same vents, creating a natural air conditioning system that kept the house 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the temperature outside. The system was, in essence, a passive geothermal heating and cooling installation, a technology that would not be formally studied, named, or engineered for another century. Thomas did not call it geothermal. He did not call it a system. He called it common sense. The earth is warm in winter and cool in summer, he told Brennan during a visit. I just gave it away to share. The ranch expanded steadily. Thomas used the Yale stipend and the small income he earned guiding occasional visitors, journalists, scientists, the simply curious, to purchase adjacent parcels of land as they came available. By 1875, he owned 60 acres. He ran a small herd of cattle, never more than 30 head, on the grass-covered portions of his land. He kept chickens, maintained a kitchen garden that Clara tended with military precision, and built a smokehouse for preserving meat. Clara planted apple trees along the south-facing slope of the bluff, 3 varieties, carefully selected from a nursery catalog, trees that wouldn't bear fruit for 5 years. Planting an orchard that wouldn't produce for half a decade was an act of faith in the future that Thomas found both deeply admirable and slightly terrifying. It meant she intended to stay. Their first child, a son named Henrik after Clara's father, was born in 1871. A daughter, Margaret, followed in 1873. A second son, James, named after James Dwight Dana, though Thomas never admitted this to anyone except Clara, who smiled and kept his secret, arrived in 1876. The children grew up running between the surface ranch house and the underground chambers, treating the fossil study as a playroom, the warm stone corridors as their natural habitat, and the geological wonders around them as the ordinary furniture of childhood. Henrik the Elder, Clara's father, lived until 1878. He spent his last years in the underground rooms where his breathing was easiest, carving wooden toys for his grandchildren with hands that had lost their strength but never their steadiness. He died in the room where he'd first been able to breathe freely, and Thomas buried him on the bluff overlooking the ranch, under a limestone marker carved with a simple inscription, Henrik Engel. He built well. Thomas continued his scientific work throughout these years with the same quiet persistence he brought to everything else. He corresponded regularly with Marsh, with Brennan, who had risen to a junior professorship at Yale, and with a growing network of geologists, paleontologists, and natural historians who regarded the Adler site as one of the most significant fossil localities in the Nebraska Territory. Thomas published no papers himself. He had no credentials, no institutional affiliation, and no interest in academic prestige. But his observations appeared, properly credited, in the published work of others. Brennan's 1874 monograph on Paleozoic fishes of the western interior cited Mr. Thomas Adler, whose meticulous field observations and unwavering site stewardship have been indispensable to this research. The recognition pleased Thomas, but less than the work itself. He continued to explore the underground complex, carefully expanding chambers and passages and discovering new specimens with each advance into the limestone. In 1877, he broke through into a second dissolution cavity deeper in the bluff, this one larger than the first, containing stalactite and stalagmite formations and a small underground pool fed by mineral-rich seepage from above. The pool water was warm, nearly 70 degrees, and had a faintly sulfurous taste. Clara used it for washing. Thomas used it for thinking. He would sit on the pool's limestone rim in the evenings after the children were asleep, his feet in the warm water, his mind turning over questions about the rock and the deep heat and the ancient ocean that had left its dead behind in the stone around him. Meanwhile, the world Thomas had left behind continued turning, though not always kindly for those who had dismissed him. His brother Edwin's letter had been the last communication between them for nearly a decade. Thomas learned through a cousin's letter, received in the autumn of 1875, that Edwin had invested the proceeds from their father's farm and a considerable sum borrowed against his own house in a railroad venture promoted by a consortium of speculators in Cleveland. The panic of 1873 had destroyed the venture utterly. Edwin lost everything: the investment, the house, the borrowed money, and eventually his wife Prudence, who took the children and returned to her family in Virginia. Edwin moved to Cincinnati and found work in a warehouse on the river, hauling freight for wages that barely covered the rent on his boarding house room. He died in 1881 of pneumonia at the age of 52, in a room that cost 50 cents a night. Thomas received this news in a letter that took 3 months to reach him. He read it at his stone table in the underground study, surrounded by 300-million-year-old fossils and the warm breath of the earth, and he sat with it for a very long time. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel vindication. He felt the particular sadness of a man who understands that the people who hurt him were not evil, but merely limited, unable to see past the surface of things, unable to imagine that a quiet man and a collapsed silo and $3 could amount to anything worth respecting. "Do you want to talk about it?" Clara asked that evening, when she found him still sitting in the study past midnight. "There's nothing to say. He made his choices. I made mine. You could be angry. At whom? He's dead. Anger at a dead man is just noise." Clara studied his face in the lantern light. "You're not angry," she said. "You're sad." Thomas was quiet for a long time. The warm air moved around them, rising from the fissure in its eternal, slow exhalation. "I'm sad that he never came here," he said finally. "I think he would have liked the fossils. I think if he'd seen the fish in the wall, he might have understood. Why I stayed, why I built, why this mattered. But he never came, and now he can't." It was the closest Thomas ever came to acknowledging the full weight of what his family had cost him, and what he had constructed in its place. Griff Holloway, the rancher who had laughed loudest at the auction, fared better than Edwin, but followed a long downward slope. His 600 acres of grassland, overgrazed and poorly managed, suffered catastrophically during the drought of 1874. He lost half his herd and was forced to sell 200 acres to cover debts. He recovered partially, but the recovery was thin and precarious, and each subsequent bad year peeled away another layer of his holdings. By 1880, he was leasing portions of his diminished land to smaller operators and spending his evenings at the saloon in town, drinking whiskey he couldn't quite afford. In the winter of 1879, Holloway knocked on Thomas's door, the surface door, not the underground one, and asked, with the careful casualness of a proud man requesting help, how the underground heating system worked and whether something similar might be built beneath a conventional ranch house. Thomas invited him in, sat him down, and spent an entire afternoon explaining the principles: thermal mass, geothermal heat rise, passive ventilation, the relationship between depth and temperature stability. He drew diagrams. He showed Holloway the fissure, the vents, the floor ducts. He offered to help survey Holloway's land for suitable sites. Holloway listened carefully, nodded throughout, and ultimately did nothing. It would require too much digging, he said, too much time, too much patience. Thomas understood. He was not offended. Most things worth building required exactly those things, and most people were not willing to provide them. That was not a moral failing. It was simply a fact, the same way limestone was a fact, and warmth, and time. The 1880s were the fullest years, the years when everything Thomas had built, the ranch, the family, the underground complex, the scientific reputation, reached a kind of equilibrium, a sustained flourishing that resembled the steady warmth of the geothermal chambers themselves. Thomas was in his 40s, strong from decades of physical labor, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, his hands scarred and calloused and sure. Clara was in her late 30s, tireless, sharp-tongued when necessary, and gentle when it mattered, managing the household and the ranch finances with an efficiency that Thomas freely admitted surpassed his own. Young Henrik, now a teenager, had inherited his maternal grandfather's gift for carpentry and was already building furniture for the ranch: tables, chairs, bed frames, storage chests. From walnut and cedar he harvested himself. His work was clean and precise, and Thomas watched him with a pride he rarely expressed in words. Margaret, at 10, had developed a passion for botany, spending hours on the prairie cataloging wildflowers, pressing specimens, and maintaining a notebook that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her father's. James, the youngest, was the reader, the dreamer, the one most like Thomas himself in temperament, if not in circumstance. He consumed books with the appetite of a starving man at a banquet, and by the age of 12 had written a 20-page essay on limestone formation and dissolution in the Nebraska plains that Arthur Brennan, visiting the ranch in 1888, pronounced better organized and more clearly argued than most undergraduate work he'd seen at Yale. Thomas taught all three children the same fundamental lesson, repeated in different forms across 1,000 ordinary moments. Look at what's in front of you before you decide what to do about it, he told them. Look carefully and look more than once. Most people decide first and look later. And that's why most people are surprised by things they shouldn't be surprised by at all. Clara, for her part, taught them to make the world around them beautiful, not merely functional. She planted gardens above and below ground. Herbs thrived in the underground chambers where the constant warmth and humidity created a year-round growing season, and flowers bloomed on the surface in beds she maintained along the path to the ranch house. She whitewashed the interior walls of the underground rooms every spring, hung curtains she sewed from fabric ordered by catalog from Omaha, and arranged wildflowers in jars on every flat surface. She transformed an underground complex carved from raw stone into a place that felt not just safe, not just warm, but loved. Visitors often forgot, within minutes of descending the staircase, that they were underground at all. The visitors came more frequently as the decade progressed. Scientists continued to arrive every year or two, but now they were joined by journalists, curious travelers, neighboring settlers who had heard the story and wanted to see for themselves, and the occasional government official. A reporter from the Omaha Daily Herald visited in 1883 and produced an article that Thomas found embarrassing in its enthusiasm and Clara found delightful. The headline read, "Nebraska's Underground Rancher, the man who turned a $3 hole into a scientific wonder." Thomas objected to the word wonder. Clara framed the article and hung it in the fossil study, where it remained for the next 30 years. The reporter had observed something that Thomas himself rarely paused to appreciate because he lived inside it, and the slow accumulation of daily work made it invisible to him, the sheer improbable scale of what he had built. By 1883, the underground complex comprised 7 connected chambers representing nearly 2,000 square feet of living and working space, all carved from solid limestone, maintained at a constant temperature between 58 and 65 degrees by the natural geothermal system Thomas had identified and harnessed. The surface ranch house, built entirely from recycled silo stone, added another 800 square feet. The property included a barn, a chicken house, a smokehouse, a root cellar separate from the underground pantry, Clara's apple orchard, now in full production, yielding bushels of fruit each autumn, and 60 acres of grazing land supporting 30 head of cattle. All of it grown from a $3 lot and a collapsed silo, all of it built by hand, over 16 years, by a man and a woman who understood that patience was not the absence of action, but the commitment to sustained action over time. Surviving was building. They had survived, and they had built, and the two activities had been the same thing all along. Thomas Adler lived to be 78 years old. In his later years, he slowed, but never stopped. He continued to expand the underground complex at the rate of a few inches per week, chiseling into the limestone each morning with the same steady rhythm he had maintained for decades. His hands, which had always been his best tools, grew stiff with arthritis in his 60s, and Clara made him a pair of padded gloves from sheepskin that allowed him to grip the chisel without pain. He wore them until they fell apart, and she made him another pair without being asked. He continued to correspond with scientists until the last years of his life. The Adler site, as it was universally known in geological literature by the 1890s, was cited in over 30 publications between 1870 and 1910. Thomas never sought credit beyond what was offered freely, but credit found him anyway. In 1891, the Nebraska Academy of Sciences awarded him an honorary membership, a distinction usually reserved for university professors and published researchers. Thomas attended the ceremony in Lincoln, wearing the best suit Clara had sewn for him, and gave an acceptance speech that lasted 4 minutes. "I didn't discover anything," he told the assembled scientists. "The fossils were there before I was. The warmth was there before I was. The stone was there before anything was. All I did was pay attention. All I did was look." The audience applauded. Thomas sat down, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, and spent the rest of the evening in the corner of the reception hall, asking a young geology student named Mary Patterson about her research on Cretaceous sediments and listening with the genuine interest that had defined his entire life. Clara died in the autumn of 1909 at the age of 67. Her heart, the doctor said, a weakness that had been developing for years, silently, the way limestone dissolves from within. She spent her last weeks in the underground bedroom she and Thomas had shared for nearly 40 years, the room she had designed and decorated, the room whose warm stone walls she had whitewashed every spring for 4 decades. Thomas sat beside her through every day and most nights, holding her hand, which was still rough and calloused from a lifetime of building. "Don't stop," she told him on her last evening, "building. Promise me." "I promise." She building. "Promise me." "I promise." She closed her eyes. Thomas held her hand until it cooled, and then for a long time after. He buried her beside her father on the bluff, under a limestone marker he carved himself. The inscription read, "Clara Engel Adler, she made it beautiful." Thomas did not stop. He had promised, and he was a man who kept his word. In the 5 years between Clara's death and his own, the underground complex grew by 2 more small chambers. One he called the meditation room, a small, quiet space with smooth walls and a single shelf for a candle, where he went to sit in the warmth and the silence and think about things that were gone. The other he built as a library for James's ever-growing collection of books, lining the walls with shelves of walnut that young Henrik had milled and finished with the craftsmanship of a master. The children were grown and scattered by then, building lives of their own. Henrik ran a successful carpentry business in Omaha, known for furniture of exceptional quality. Margaret taught botany at a women's college in Iowa and published a field guide to prairie wildflowers that remained in print for 30 years. James had earned a degree in geology from the University of Nebraska and joined the U.S. Geological Survey, mapping formations across the western states. But they came back, every Christmas, every summer. They brought their own children, who ran through the stone corridors and pressed their small hands against the warm walls and asked the same question children always ask about miraculous things. "Why? Why is the rock warm, grandfather?" Thomas would lift the child onto his knee, his arthritic hands steady enough for that, and tell them about the ocean. The ancient ocean that had covered this land before there was land, before there were people, before there was anything but water and stone and time. He told them about the fish in the wall, and the shells, and the creatures that had lived and died, and become part of the earth itself. And he told them that the earth remembered, that the warmth they felt in the stone was the earth's memory of being alive, of holding life inside it, of carrying the heat of creation upward through the rock for anyone patient enough to find it. It was not scientifically precise, but it was true in the way that the best stories are true. True to the feeling of the thing, true to the wonder of it, true to the experience of pressing your hand against warm stone in winter and feeling something answer. Thomas died on February 12th, 1914, at the age of 78, in the underground bedroom. It was winter, deep winter, and the shaft was warm as it had always been. All 3 of his children were present, and 5 of his 7 grandchildren. James, who had inherited his father's leather notebook and the habit of recording everything, noted the temperature that day. 59 degrees Fahrenheit, steady, unchanging, reliable as a heartbeat. Outside, the wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie, and the wind chill plunged to 20 below zero, and the world above was white and frozen and savage. Down here, it was warm. Thomas's last words, according to James's careful account, were spoken to his youngest granddaughter, a girl of 6 named Clara after her grandmother. She had climbed onto his bed and asked him, with the earnest gravity of a child who senses that something important is ending, whether there was anything left to find in the cave. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes, dimmed by age but never by indifference, held the same quality of attention they had held when he first pressed his hand against warm limestone 50 years before. "There's always more to find," he said. "You just have to keep looking." He closed his eyes and breathed out, a long, slow breath, and the warm air of the shaft carried it upward through the stone staircase, past the oak door he had built with his own hands half a century earlier, and out into the cold Nebraska sky, where it joined the wind and was gone. The Adler underground ranch remained in the family for 2 more generations. James's son, Thomas Adler II, maintained the property and expanded the surface ranch operations while preserving the underground complex as his grandfather had left it. In 1968, recognizing that the site's scientific and historical significance exceeded the family's ability to maintain it, Thomas II donated the property and its underground chambers to the University of Nebraska. The site was designated a Nebraska State Historical Landmark in 1971 and was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1983. The underground chambers are still there, open to visitors by appointment, maintained by the university's Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. The fossil study still displays the same Paleozoic fish that stopped Thomas Adler in his tracks on a March day in 1868, now formally identified and classified as Adleria nebraskensis, a genus named in his honor in a 1922 monograph by Arthur Brennan, who had by then become one of the foremost paleontologists of his generation. The thermal fissure still breathes warm air into the shaft. The calcite formations on the study walls still glow amber in lamplight. The temperature at the bottom of the original chamber, measured by university researchers in 2019 using digital instruments far more precise than Thomas's hand and his judgment, was 59 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly what he recorded in his leather notebook 151 years earlier. The stone remembers. It has always remembered. Modern geothermal engineers have studied the Adler site as a remarkably early example of passive geothermal design. Thomas's integration of the natural thermal fissure with constructed ventilation shafts, the angled passages Clara helped him design in 1870, anticipated principles of earth-air heat exchange that would not be formally engineered or commercially applied until the 1970s. His intuitive understanding of thermal mass, natural convection, and the relationship between underground and surface structures created a climate control system of considerable sophistication. Assembled entirely without formal training, without external funding, and without any tool more complex than a chisel and a hammer and the steady application of human intelligence to a natural problem. $3 bought him a collapsed silo and 11 acres of scrub prairie that nobody wanted. What he built with those raw materials, with his hands, his patience, his curiosity, and the partnership of a woman who saw what others could not be bothered to look for, was a home, a scientific site, a family, and a legacy that outlasted every person who laughed at him on that October morning in 1867. There is a plaque at the entrance to the underground complex, placed there by the University of Nebraska in 1971, when the site was first designated a landmark. The plaque bears a quotation from Thomas Adler's leather notebook, dated November 3, 1867, 3 weeks after he paid $3 for a ruin that everyone else considered worthless. The stone is warm. I do not yet know why, but I intend to find out, and I intend to stay. He found out. He stayed. He built. And the stone is still warm.